Good afternoon and welcome to the Wichita-Sedgwick County Historical Museum. I see so many familiar faces out there and also some I don't recognize. So welcome this afternoon. It's a special privilege for us. I'm Eric Kale, by the way, museum director, and it's my special privilege to have our esteemed guest here, someone I know many of you know personally, and we're very privileged to have a professor of history from the nation's. It's just been recently again recognized as one of the finest liberal arts college in the United States, which means the world, I think. And Williams College, Professor Emeritus of History. That alone is wonderful, but the fact that John Hyde is a primary resource person for his grandfather, A. Hyde, just makes this a doubly wonderful occasion. And I so appreciate you coming all this way for this talk. Let's welcome John Hyde.
In thanking, before I even say anything, the Hydes had a hard of hearing problem. And if there's any problem, just raise your hand. I'm good at it. I had to yell at Aunt Ruth and speak softly to Aunt Mary. I had to decide which was which. But I don't want to be simply perfunctory in my response to Eric. I'm pleased and I'm grateful to be asked whenever I come out. And I hope what I have to say will be interesting to all of you. This organization, I'm particularly pleased that I'm here in the 75th year of this organization, of the Wichita Historical Museum, because it marks, this institution was the one that got me inspired to begin doing research on my grandfather and on mentholatum. And by the way, this talk is not about mentholatum. Okay, get that straight. I've done that. If you want to hear that one, I can do it anytime you want to. But this is about Wichita and A.A. Hyde. And many years ago, as a young man, I brought my mother out who liked to come and see old friends. And we went to the museum. I was up in the Beachy Mansion on Douglas. And a young woman showed me took me through, I told her who I was, and we got into a room. She said, well, you know, we have a room for mentholatum. And I said, well, let's go look. And so we went in, and they had quite a few artifacts. And she said to me, now, Professor Hyde, we want you to perhaps correct something, but we take school children through here. And we take them into this room and we tell them that this was a cold product for colds and things, and that this gentleman, Mr. A.A. Hyde, who started it, had gotten the formula for it from an Indian. And the children get quite excited, and they said, did the Indians use mentholatum? And I said, well, no, it was supposed to work differently. He got the idea from it and he made it. And I said, well, I hate to disappoint the school children of Wichita, but no, that's not how it got started. And I know how it got started through documents. I'm a historian. So I will send you a little essay. Well, ultimately, I worked it up into an article and got it published in the Kansas Historical Journal of the university. It's a good article. And I've gotten objections to people here in Wichita, now gone, who said, no, I gave your grandfather that formula. And he never recognized it. Well, my grandfather wasn't that kind of thing. I was born here, but unlike my grandfather, I did not grow up here. So coming back is something I come back to a place I remember, but not to home. This isn't home anymore. People that I knew are long gone, and I've been given an opportunity to reconnect with this city by being asked, for reasons I didn't understand, to be a member of the Wichita Public Library Foundation, which pleased me. I said to the young woman who asked, sure, I'd be glad to be on it, but why? And she said, "Your name is Hyde and you're an academic." And that serves us well, and I've done it. So in moving towards my comments for this talk, I want to simply conclude by saying, look, cities and universities are known by their internal institutions. They're known by their art museums, their historical museums, and above all, by their libraries. And Wichita is on the verge of moving towards adding to its public institutions a new library. And I simply want to urge you, please support it. I've been on the board for 12 years. You have no idea how this library serves this community in places you'd never imagine. And so please help us out. Now, I've got to do a brief professorial. Don't worry, I'm not going to be that long-winded on anything but this. I've got to do a brief professorial comment before I start. In English, we use the word history, and we mean the past. But the past is an endless web, tangled web of strands and pieces put together, but in no order or in any kind of meaningful way. It takes a historian to make history, because the historian will ask a question, and then he will start pulling the strands out of that tangled web to create an answer. Somebody else may ask the same question and pull different strands. But there have to be strands to be history. Otherwise, it's fiction. And so if somebody says to you, "How do you know that?" I have to say, "This is my strand. This is where I get this from." You can go check it. So, it's speaking to you today, but I have to play two roles. I will be a historian, and you will know when I'm being a historian. I will refer to AA, or his childhood name. You should also know that I also speak as one of the strands, because I'm a grandson. And I remember my grandfather. And I was the last family to live in grandfather's house up on College Hill, which you will see at a later point. And so I'm going to move about between those two roles, and you'll understand. I'm not going to each time say, "Now I'm being a strand." I will use the word grandfather, and that means either stories I know or how I remember him with it. And I picked these opening pictures. That's grandfather in 1872. That's what he looked like when he comes to Williamstown. This is him in the 1930s before he died, and he's holding me. So I felt that it was a nice connection as we move into it. Okay, now let's make sure we get started here in the right way. Eric, are you here?
Yes.
No, I know, I push that, don't I? Yeah, okay, go ahead. This is the house where he was born. It's in the little town of Lee, Massachusetts, in the Berkshire Hills of western Massachusetts. And it was built by his grandfather in 1792. It still stands, by the way. AA was the fifth child and second son of what was to become a family of 9 children, and his family called him Bert. But in the world in which he grew up, it's very different than ours. You did not call a person by their first name unless you were family or very, very close to the family. You could call that person by a nickname, but normally you would refer to him as Mr. Hyde or AA Hyde, and that's where the AA came into it. His grandfather was the minister of the local Congregational church, and the church was an abiding influence on his life from the time he was a child. His grandfather, Alvin Hyde, had been the first minister of this church, not this church building, but of this church. And he served in that role from 1792 until he died in 1833. During his tenure, and I mention this for refer back to in talking about Wichita, he decided to sponsor the end of spirituous liquors at meetings of ministers in Berkshire County, which evidently consumed quite a quantity of spirituous liquor. And so he decided that the church would allow no liquor, and this involved the communion service, and it would be non-liquor. One of his parishioners noted, he never quite spoke as eloquently as when he had a glass of rum before entering the pulpit. Because in those years, sermons were an hour to an hour and a half, and a good stiff drink could help you get through it. And so his son took over the family home when his father died and took care of his mother. There was no Social Security. And to make a living, since he was a graduate of Williams College, you could either be a pastor or you could be a teacher. And so he became a teacher. And he started a family boarding school in the family home. And it lasted from 1837 until 1868 or so. But it never made money. And once when AA was asked about philanthropy and where he learned about it, he said, well, I didn't learn about it growing up because we didn't have enough money to give away. We had trouble getting enough money to live on this. So it wasn't, this idea of philanthropy was not part of it. His father was the village schoolmaster, and the school had a diverse student body. It included Hawaiians, racially, a Kiowa Indian who died while he was at the school. He is buried in the Hyde family plot in Lee, Massachusetts. But they put on his name, the sentiments are religious, but they gave him his Kiowa name, not his Christian name, Sa Delta. And so it comes in that one. Now, young Bert grew up in Lee. He went to school. And in 1865, note the date, he graduates. He is 17 years old. And his brother, George, was older and had served in the Civil War. And one of the things that happened, so the war comes to an end in 1865, and George, many of these young men getting out of the Army had made connections. And so he got a job in Leavenworth, Kansas, working with a bank, and through someone he had known during the war. Lee was a small town, still is. There wasn't much prospect there. So he goes out to Leavenworth, and he writes his brother Bert and says, come on out. I'll get you a job. I'll give you a job. And so Bert decides to go join his brother in Leavenworth. Frontier towns were not pretty. Don't look for nice parks and trees and anything. They grew up in a hurry. They were messy. As you can see what the main street that's leading down to the river looked like in those years. And so Bert, his brother George, got a job for him in a bank. And there, the bank owner, who liked the young man, said to him, but you can't write well. And his father didn't believe in his educational principles in making you do penmanship. Some of you here probably had to do penmanship when you were going to school. And his father thought that was silly. And so the bank president said to him, young man, if you want to keep a job in this bank, you are to take penmanship lessons. And I have secured a penmanship tutor for you, and it will cost you $5 a month, which will be taken out of your salary in order to make you someone that can be a banker. And to the day of his death, you could always tell in his handwriting whether he was using his pre-penmanship lessons or when he was using his penmanship lessons, because it's very carefully scripted. While he was there, like young men, they wanted something to do. And he and some of the other young men in town, and his brother George, decided that what they ought to do is to form a baseball club to play baseball. But they needed property to have a diamond to play it. So in order to accomplish that, they had to buy property. And in order to buy property, they had to form themselves into a legal association. And so the Kansas Historical Society has given me a copy of the written document. Its printed, contemporary printed words are there. And I'm going to get away. I'll talk as loud as I can. But if you can read it, the objects of this association are to improve, foster, and perpetuate the American game of baseball, and to promote the cultivation of healthy and invigorating exercises and kindly feelings among the members of the club. And so the Frontier Baseball Club was founded, and it's the first, and my grandfather was evidently proud of it. It was the first chartered baseball team in the state of Kansas when he was there. He also left one note in his diary, 4th of July. We went across the river to Missouri to play a game with the town on the other side. It was a Reb town. There were no American flags flying, and only Reb songs were sung. So that the power of the Civil War and the loyalties and the arguments were still very much alive with this young man as he came here. Now, Mr. Clark, who owned the bank they worked in, liked Bert. And he saw him as a promising figure. So he called him in one day and he said, I'm going to send you down to a place on the Arkansas, do we still do call it the Arkansas River, don't we? We call it the Little River, don't we? Am I okay? Okay. I'm going down to a place on the Arkansas River that Santa Fe is going to build to hopscotch over Abilene and Newton as the place where when they drive the cattle up the Chisholm Trail, this will be the closest place. So we will set up stockyards and we will start a town there. And then we can have the monopoly on the cattle trade that will take them up by train to Kansas City and fatten them up first and then go out there. And stockyards still here? Are they gone? Yeah. Dad would make us go to the Stockyards Hotel for a meal, which was considered a great treat, but we children hated it because it smelled as we came along. In any case, so this was what it looked like before the railroad came. Now, when the Pilgrims landed, there wasn't much there, but they didn't need much. They could get the lumber from the trees. They learned the Indians and everybody else, how to eat. It was a pre-industrial society. This is an industrial society. You're getting a railroad. You can get there fast. And you're going to need what a settlement in an industrial economy needs. You're going to have to build stores. You're going to have to plant streets. You've got to have courts, churches. You've got to do all these things. And it's got to be done fast. In order, when the railroad arrives, there's something here where people can stay, where the cowboys can whoop it up. So lots of saloons, lots of gambling joints. This is what you have to do if you're going to start a town on the prairie. It's from nothing, and then you move on. So the Santa Fe comes to Wichita in the summer of 1872. And a month after the train arrived, young Bert came down from Leavenworth to become the cashier of the Wichita Savings Bank, which was located in this building, which was just up the street. It was on the corner of Main and Douglas. So that's the corner of Main and Douglas, and that building there, on the furthest right of all of us here, is that right? Yeah. The right is the Wichita Savings Bank. And so that's where he did. I want you particularly to notice who the other officers were. Saul Cohn, Samuel Levy. From the time he arrived here, he was involved and knew well the small Jewish community. And that was a relationship that continued throughout his life. And I've heard about it in subsequent times. Now, where does a young man just arriving with his satchel or whatever it was, where does he live? Well, Mr. Cohn said to him, well, if you want to, live above the bank. I'll give you free dwellings, and you can have a roommate if you want to, but your job is to be there at night. And I'm going to cut a hole in the floor, and you're to have a pistol. And if you hear any noise downstairs, you're to scare them off with your pistol. They were not worried, by the way, about robbers. That wasn't the issue. It was these guys coming up the trail would get bloody drunk and would go around busting up windows and doing that kind of thing. And this was to protect the bank from that kind of marauding. And so young Bert spent the first months of his life here rooming with the guy who owned the Keno Palace where the First National Bank is. And it, if you can imagine it, had a platform outside where the band played all night long for them to come into. This kid from Lee, Massachusetts, in a proper home, living across from a Keno Palace and sleeping with a pistol under his pillow above the bank. He had been known by his family as a fixer. When anything needed fixed, call Bert. And so he began fixing things. Wait a minute, I may have turned it off. Just a sec, sorry. Wait a minute. Yeah, there it is. He would design little things, and this he got a patent for. It was a coin sorter. The problem was, how do you sort coins when you're behind the counter and this kind of thing? And this was something you'd drop them into. He was always doing that kind of thing. He liked it. The next thing he did, which would have been very appropriate, he joins a church. That's part of it. That's part of his heritage. Of course, that's what he would have done. There was no congregational church the way there had been in Leavenworth, so he joined the First Presbyterian Church. It was located at the corner of First and Lawrence. For the old-timers will know that is now Broadway. And it was the big church in town. And that meant that would become the focus of his social life in town. Those were the people he knew and palled around with. They invited him for suppers. They invited him for any occasion. And that's sort of he didn't join it in order to have that. That was the way a town worked. If you wanted to run a Keno Palace, fine. You'd associate with cowboys when they were town. But if you wanted proper friends, you went to a church. There was no temple. There was no Jewish temple yet. And we know that because A.A. writes in his diary about the marriage of Saul Cohn's daughter, which they had to import a rabbi from Kansas City to come down. So it meant that still the community was quite small. And this gives you a sense in a small prairie town of what the size of the congregation was like. So there was a lot of people there to meet. And being a young man, you celebrated the holidays in ways somewhat different than you and I do. Christmas was considered a religious holiday. And you met with the family, and you not so much presents yet, but you went to church, and that's it. New Year's was the holiday where you had fun. And so Bert and a friend of his made up this Happy New Year card. And what they would do is go around to young women that they knew in town and present their calling card, which would then, they would go in and sit and chat, and that was a way you could meet people of the other sex by your New Year's card. Well, he met a young woman. Her name was Ida Elizabeth Todd. And Ida Todd has a kind of interesting background. Like Bert and his family, they had come out from New Hampshire, her father. Her mother had died in childbirth. And as a consequence of that, Mr. Todd had remarried. So this is the child by their first marriage. But Ida's mother had attended Mount Holyoke College 6 years after Mary Lyons founded it as the first women's college in this country. Mount Holyoke Seminary was called originally. So that was very much part of her history in coming into the village. She was a lovely young woman, and Bert asked her to marry him, and they were married in January of 1875 in the First Presbyterian Church. She was 20, and he was 27. Their first home was at the corner of 2nd and Topeka, southeast corner of 2nd and Topeka. Shirkmere, I think, used to be, that was there anymore, not, it's about where that is. Originally, it was one story. This would have been a family home. I don't think AA built it, but he did put on the second floor because they immediately began having children. Every 2 years, one would appear, as understood. But that was where he began his married life, was downtown, what you and I would call downtown. He also got involved with politics. He was elected, I'm not sure whether it was an appointment or elected, to serve on the Board of Education in 1875 because he was a schoolmaster's son, and it was assumed that he would know about schools and what they should be. He was 27 years old. This was a young person's town to go onto the Board of Education, and he was a member until 1880. He was a trustee of the Wichita Children's Home. This is for abandoned children and orphans and things. And the only political activity I ever found about him was he ran for mayor in 1883 on, of all things, the prohibition ticket. Prohibition of liquor, given his own background, and he was predictably clobbered. All the business that revolved around the Keno palaces and the saloons, really got things going against him. He was still on the board when the Wichita High School graduated its first class. It had 3 people. And the way a graduation was conducted, which was true until the 1890s, is that every member of the class had to perform in some way. You could sing a song, or the phrase that was used was you could say a piece. You would memorize a poem, or you would memorize something and you would say it. And each of these young people gave it. The audience of those years had an incredible hunger for speeches. It would go on forever. But there was a rumpus in the 1890s when the Board of Education, I don't think he was on at that time, he served later on, the Board of Education decided they would stop having every person in the class give a piece or sing a song, and certain ones would be elected. So you would get the valedictorian or the salutatorian, and there would be some reason that you would be asked to speak. And of course, a lot of families' noses were out of joint that their kid didn't get a chance to do what the other ones did. His children went to the elementary school. It was a 3-room school. The principal and one of the teachers was a woman named Ella Taft. She's over here. And this is the group of students that were gathered. And AA wrote on the back of this picture the name of all the people, of all the children. And a lot of very recognizable Wichita names are there. Niederlander, various, particularly the German names that had come out here to do it. Some children clearly with health problems, you can see in this from various ones. The ones I like, the boys all wore caps, and there were 2 Hydes in the picture. This is my Aunt Ruth, who was the character in the family, and was till she was run over by a car outside the A&P in 1945. And the other is her brother Paul, who's there, who became one of the early champions of the Wichita Country Club golf tournament. Aunt Ruth, we children, I got to tell you, when she grew up, she was wonderful. We kids loved her. She'd go traveling and she'd bring things back for us, sort of exotic things. But I also remember, and my mother told more of this story, she was the first woman to smoke in public on the streets of Wichita. She wore rouge and did other things that proper ladies should not do. So when her brothers would come to town and the family would gather twice a year, she said the brothers would sit around the table and they'd say to her, "Ruth, why in God's name do you go around town smoking? You know father wouldn't like that kind of thing at all. Why do you wear rouge?" Aunt Ruth's answer every time was, "I know, Eddie, I know I shouldn't do that." And that was the way she got out of it. She accepted the criticism and said, in effect, that's what I'm going to do. And she did, to the very end. Her last husband was carried bags for the A&P, and they fell in love, and you never know those things. But AA was by this time, growing into a respected businessman in town with a growing family. How do you raise your income? I mean, you weren't paid very much as a banker, maybe $250, $300 a month. How can you grow your income and support the family in the way you wanted to? In many the newspapers and the Eagle of the day, he was obviously very respected. They would have nicknames for a lot of businessmen in town. It was always referred to as Mr. A.A. Hyde or A.A. Hyde. So the best investment you could make as a young man was land, buy land. It was easily available. You could hold on to it and then sell it at a profit. And his first piece of land, one of the first was to develop an addition on the east side of town, just a few blocks from us here. And what you would do is you would buy up the addition. Then you would get it platted and have streets, and you'd name the streets. You had the right to name the streets. And then along each street would be these little lots, and you'd sell them. And you made quite a bit of money on that prospect with it, and you would use the money to reinvest in land. This is the beginning of the boom of the city to grow, and you would speculate on buying land, that this piece that you got would get it better. He is best remembered, and still exists, he named the streets after the women in his life. And I will tell you who they are. One was Ida. Ida Street was named after his wife. Lulu McCabe Hewitt, who was the wife of the pastor of the Presbyterian Church. Laura Street, named after his sister-in-law, Loretta Todd, who she was the wife of Ida's brother. And she had, as a child, we would go visit her. She had a pearl-handled revolver that she claimed a gunslinger. Aunt Reddy, we called her Aunt Reddy. Aunt Reddy was a tough old lady. And she would say, "You want to see how I can shoot?" And she'd take us out back, and she had a barn. And she would pull this thing out, load it, sit there and ping away at the barn so we would see what she had learned. Then Patty Street was Ida's sister, and Ida's sister married George Strong, who was one of the founders of what was to become Fairmount, Wichita State. George went wrong, as one of my aunts said, but that's beside the point. Ellis Street. And that's named after, and I'm going to mention him later, that's the only male in the equipment, and he was a landscape architect. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And the last one is my favorite. It was Fanny Street, okay? Now, it's an amusing example of changes in the meanings of words. She was the youngest daughter of Hiram Lewis, who was president of the Kansas National Bank, where Bert had been the cashier. It was a very popular girl's name in the 19th century. but it took on, as time went on, a less dignified meaning. And so the petition of the residents in 1940 was to change the name of Fanny Street to Greenwood Street, which it still is, I believe. The city council, in its wisdom, said they would do it, but only after Fanny died. And so it comes late as to what it is. Bill Ellington and I used to argue that we would like to start a new association for Restore Fanny Street, and being a lobby thing. Now, as this boom came along and AA was making money, he resigned from the bank and he became a loan broker. He became a speculator in land. And foreseeing the rise and growth of the city on the prairie to the east, and what you people call a hill, which in the east would be referred to as a rise in the road, what came to be called College Hill. And there he developed quite a few new additions came in which you named the streets. And originally, the one that AA got involved with was called Brooklyn Heights. And he had a sister who lived in Brooklyn Heights. Brooklyn Heights is still in Brooklyn, New York, is still a very proper place to live. And it was bounded by Bluff and Clifton, with Moser Avenue, now Roosevelt, going down the middle. And Moser Avenue was later named Roosevelt, which honored Teddy. And there's that now new television program going on about the Roosevelt. But notice how a city grows territorially in these additions and the plotting of them. And then you would lay claim to it by building a house on it. AA was a significant contributor to the growth of the city in terms of land and boundaries as it moved out. At this point in his life, the risk he took was too great. But in the meantime, he built himself a proper mansion at 2nd and Roosevelt, northwest corner of 2nd and Roosevelt. He engaged the local architectural firm of Proudfoot and Bird and said, design it for me. And the property took up almost half a block. And in recognition of its significance and size, which you did at that time, you gave it a name. Rather than thinking of a street address, you would say, we call our house Hillcrest. And I often wonder if they stopped using it very soon. It didn't continue. But even now, if I'm coming west on Kellogg, and you come to that just edge of the hill, and going west, and you look and you see Wichita spread out in front of you. And it must have been a lovely setting for a home, because there were no trees between you and the river. So you would watch it, and in his diary he talks about what they see and what's going on and the trees that are coming and who's building to it. So it was a lovely place. And at the same time that he built this, he decided to, he with some other men, businessmen in town, decided that the organization this town really needed was a YMCA. And he goes back to his 1872, 1873 years. You know, a young, proper man coming to town, staying over a bank or sort of flop houses in town, they fought, and he had learned about the YMCA. And the YMCA was designed to serve precisely people like A.A. Hyde, a proper place to go, to live, to have a library, to have recreation facilities, these kind of things. It had started in England, and A.A. caught on to that. And so he said, all right, and they had a YMCA, small. He said, all right, let's build a proper building. And so he invested $25,000, I think, along with some other men, to build this building for the YMCA. And then the bust came. And AA, to his credit, paid off his pledge. I don't know how he did it, but a lot of people didn't, and it went broke, and the Masonic Order took it over, and I believe it still stands. Am I right? It's a proud bird. It's a real piece of Wichita history, but it was to be the YMCA. Then, as Eric and some of the other people know, with his brother-in-law, George Strong, he purchased land along hillside of the streetcar line, because the streetcar line was important in this. He helped to finance to establish a new cemetery in town, which was called Maple Grove and still is. He was the major shareholder. But the importance of Maple Grove was that it was not to be laid out the way most cemeteries were, in rows and rows and rows. It was to be a park. And that's where he hired Ellis, who was a landscape architect in the East who designed cemeteries. And if you go up to Maple Grove, you could see the winding streets and the sort of park-like atmosphere that AA and his friends wanted it to do. His sons, my older uncles, remembered that particularly after when the bust came, the cemetery was the sole source of the family's income because people had to buy graves, and that brought cash in it a little. But since it was to be a park, he planted trees. Trees were a very important part of city growing. And with those trees, you had to water them weekly. And so these boys on Saturday of their school week spent hours carrying buckets of water to water those trees you now see in Maple Grove Park. Finally, he wanted, because of his brother and friends that he knew, he wanted to honor the veterans of the Civil War. And he created this little memorial, and the plots surrounding it, you can see it, the little headstones, where any member of the GAR who died could be buried there. I once asked, I think I asked Eric or his predecessor, whether if you had served in the Confederate Army, whether that would be honored. We all agreed probably not in those years, but that's a guess. Another investment, and by the way, I brought this with me, I just thought I'd show it to you because it's the only thing I have. He joined up with a guy named Ike Humble, and they started a bookstore. AA loved to read. It's down on Main Street. Hyde and Humble. And they sold books. Grandfather had a great loving. He read aloud to his children. He loved Pickwick Papers. He loved Dickens. He loved all this kind of arrangement. He sold stationery. And he sold little souvenirs. This was a souvenir. And I think it's because AA liked it. They're lithographs of Wichita. They're really very well preserved. Lorraine will get it. I'm building an archive at WSU, but that's for later. But in any case, that was another of his investments. It didn't go very far, but it stayed there for about 1893. And it probably didn't turn over much money. My favorite, which is we know almost nothing about, was the College Hill S&B Club. And it was formed by the residents who lived out on College Hill. And they obviously formed a separate little community. And so they formed a club. And we think S&B stood for social and business, given what the itinerary, what the club did. It met once a month. The dues were 50 cents a year. People of any age could join. My Mary Hyde, the oldest daughter of AA, was a teen, and she's listed among the members, and they only had to pay 25 cents a year to join the club. And they would meet, and they would do different things. And I just want to list some of them because this tells you, the only thing I can have, what social life was like. Because the more you tell the story, it makes it seem as if everything was very somber and you had to be, churchy and and talk about good works. And I was quite relieved to find out about the S&B Club and that they did have fun. The business part about it, the committee, they had a legislative committee to deal with the city council. And one of the things was that they reported that 2 petitions had circulated to obtain sidewalks on Douglas and Park. Then when they turned to social life, well, other things they did, AA Hyde was given the responsibility to get the town to put on street signs on College Hill so you knew what street it was. And AA Hyde moved that the club help in securing a telephone on the hill with the telephone. Again, AA's fascination with anything new, and the telephone was coming in. But I like the social part of it. There was one on the January of 1889 in which each, the men and the women, and by the way, the women were very active in it, drew up a series of 28 conundrums. And the gentlemen were to answer 6 and the ladies were to answer 5 of them. I don't know what the conundrums were or anything else, but that was considered having a good time, was to do this. Then among the exercises where they gave pieces, spoke pieces, it tells you the great pneumatic tube for conveying freight and passengers between England and America, this idea you would dig a tunnel under the Atlantic. A.A. Hyde spoke on the phonograph and its uses. Again, his fascination with the mechanics. And one I like, if there are any real estate dealers in the audience, has the common man any rights which a real estate owner is bound to respect? J.D. Hutchings gave that. Finally, there was a debate. And those of you here will probably aren't aware of this issue, but it had arisen by that time. The debate was resolved that the same political rights should be enjoyed by women that are by men. This is the beginning of the push for women's suffrage. J.P. Campbell and J.N. Haymaker were to argue for the positive, and W.A. Morris and Irvin Stratton were to argue the negative. The affirmative won, and at the next meeting, the club voted to dissolve. Whether there was any relationship, I don't have the faintest idea with that. So that's the story of the glory years when the Hydes were really prospering. So grandfather had a photographer come to the thing that would have one of these flash things that would pop and would scare you, to take a picture of his family. And it had grown by this time this was taken to full size, 9 children and an aged aunt, one of Ida's Aunt Jane. They all loved her. She was born in 1818 and couldn't write. She told her son-in-law or her nephew what she wanted to do with her belongings. And she had a pin and she had little things she wanted to make sure got home. And so the family, just quickly, was 9 children. My father is the youngest boy, and Patty, Mrs. Barclay, for those who might remember lived on Bluff, was the youngest. She was the youngest girl. And so Patty, George, and Paul, who was the golfer, they were a group. So they sort of grouped in 3s and kept in touch with each other as they did that. But what happened was that the bust came. And AA really began to have real psychological problems with this, that he had invested other people's money, including his sister's, and it had been lost. It hadn't been lost entirely, but you couldn't recover the amount. It was all invested in land. And so He continued to live in the house. I think Hiram Lewis paid the mortgage. I think Hiram Lewis respected him. But it was to lead ultimately, which I'll mention in a minute, to the development of mentholatum. But it's also is going to shape, the bust will shape how he responded to becoming a wealthy man at this point. And the way he began to try and recover was not to keep buying land, although he always liked buying land, but much safer. He and two other men, one of whom had a formula for developing soap from the yucca plant. And so they decided they would form a company, the Yucca Company, to produce soap, and they would sell it to the pharmacies and the stores in Wichita by going around and peddling it with what it was. And so they got it started. Well, they decided they needed a few more products, and so they would develop shoe shine and other things that would be included. So you'd go to the store owner and you'd pull out the various products you could offer them, and they would buy them up. And in this company, as it grew, he had a sister come out, and her husband had been trained in a pharmacology institution in Philadelphia. And he said, Bert, I've got something that might work, might sell. It's called Vest Pocket Specific. And I've got it original. It's in a little cardboard box, a little thin bottle that was designed particularly for preachers and speakers, that you would keep in your vest, you wore vests, your vest pocket. So if your throat began to give out, you could pull out the Vest Pocket Specific and have a swig. It had a rather significant component of alcohol, but what is more important, it had as its base menthol. And grandfather became fascinated with menthol, and he said to himself, I think I could make an ointment out of this. And he began experimenting. And so by 1892, he had, the other two men had dropped out. He decided that they should incorporate the Yucca Company. And therefore, the book in the Yucca Company book, the record book of minutes, lists the owners of stock. And A.A. Hyde had 25. Dewey Wheeler, who was one of the original partners, gave his stock to A.A. and moved back east. Then Ida had 2 shares. Ike Humble, you know, the bookstore. Ike had 1. Ida had 1. Jobs was the banker in town, A.C. Jobs, and he had 2, but obviously he had funded the thing. And the last one was Helen Smith. No, Helen Smith had 2. It was her husband that had given the idea of Vest Pocket Specific. So women owned stock from the very beginning in the company. Every time I do something like this, I think he must have been a feminist, but he never preached on it. When he was, that I know of, or I don't find it. And so by 1889 or so, or 92, the Yucca Company was incorporated and the people signed their things. The Yucca Company original home was on Douglas Avenue. Now what intrigues me, I think it's still there, the original home of the Yucca Company is still on Douglas Avenue. It's a real piece of Wichita history. And this is what it looked like up at the top in 1892. Well, it's a little later than that because it refers to mentholatum. And that's what it looked like when I took a picture a few years ago. Is it still there? Yes. Yeah. Okay, I don't know what's there. But across the street, he decided, once mentholatum became the product and was being sold, he decided to build the Mentholatum Company building, which is, as you know, still there. And it's at this point in this story, I have to preach a brief sermon with your understanding. By the turn of the century, by 1900, mentholatum had become a very profitable enterprise. And so A.A. Hyde suddenly realized that he was going to be a very rich man, and perhaps surprisingly, this troubled him deeply, that he would have all this money. He kept thinking back to the trauma of the bust, that had got him in trouble, his desire for money and the purchase of land. He has said that it was as if some man had accidentally found a diamond mine on his farm or an oil well. A.A. Hyde had no special talent that deserved such financial reward. So to resolve this psychological crisis of becoming rich, and what should he do with it? He read, as he did daily, in the Bible. He looked for it in Scripture. He read other writings, particularly the Gospel of Wealth by Andrew Carnegie. But he found in the Sermon on the Mount the words that would resolve the crisis in his life. He knew the words by heart. But they suddenly took new meaning. Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, rather than on earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. That was the bust. And it was that made him change his mind about getting rich. He was in a sense not punished by God. He had learned his lesson in the bust because he had tried to collect money and to live on it. And that, he felt, had brought him to this point of his life. And so now he had to rethink it. So he came up with the conclusion that if you have surplus wealth beyond what you need to live perfectly properly, he didn't believe you should wear sackcloth and ashes and do all that stuff. It was your responsibility, God-given responsibility, to give away all your surplus wealth. A man who dies rich dies disgraced, in A.A. Hyde's mind. And A.A. Hyde was to spend the rest of his life carrying out that responsibility. He used the word the stewardship of wealth. If you become wealthy, you become a steward of that wealth. And so he took his mentholatum stock, by that time mentholatum had come, and he created a foundation, which he called the Hyde Benevolent Society. And he used the income from that to give away. And so he dropped out of pretty much running the company on day-to-day basis. He let his sons do that. And he devoted the rest of his life, basically, to giving money away. But he didn't do it easily, believe me. And so I'm going to show you some examples in Wichita of how he used that new wealth, to show you the range of interests that he had. And I'm leaving it just in Wichita for this purpose. First of all, education. Remember, he'd been on the Board of Education. He was interested in schools. And it was felt that Wichita needed a school which prepared students to go to university, but which also taught the religious truths, or taught religion, the Bible. It wasn't to be sectarian or anything like that, but it was to be that. And so AA helped to fund what came to be called Lewis Academy. And it was down, I think, on Market Street in those years. And here's a piece of stationery from Lewis Academy, and it's addressed to Mr. Potts, who was a chemist, was a druggist in town. And she's writing to him to recommend one of AA's sons, Edward, to Mr. Potts. What interested me, too, is that the person who wrote this letter, Kate Brown, was a woman, and she taught chemistry at things. So you didn't see women involved that much in science. But here she was, the chemistry teacher in what you and I would call a college prep school. It also had athletics, and Hyde had always liked athletics. The game of baseball had changed, so he didn't play that anymore. But when his children played in games, he would go to see them. He liked them, and he would encourage them. And Lewis Academy had a football team, and it went undefeated in 1904. And Paul Hyde was on the team. I keep trying to decipher the people they played. EHS couldn't be East High School because East High School wasn't born. Wasn't yet made. So I'm not sure who they played. But they played the schools, and they obviously had a record, and they had a very distinguished record with them. The other one was Fairmount Academy. When Fairmount first got started in 1895, the son of Alex, the daughter of Alex Hyde, married Harry Corbin. And he was the last president of the University of Wichita before it became Wichita State, and was responsible for it. But Sally was a lovely woman, very talented, very bright. And Sally said to me proudly the last time I saw her, "I am the last First Lady of the University of Wichita." And they built the president's house there on the campus. Then the new Presbyterian Church came into being in 1910. They needed a new church, had too many people. So they sold off the old brick church, and they started to build it up at Elm and Lawrence, Broadway. And in doing that, it caused a bit of a ruckus in the congregation. And this tells you what it's like in a city where transportation is still largely public rather than private. And this meant, if you think about it, if the trolley line came down First Street, went out to College Hill to the east of town, or even Second, I'm not sure which one it did, but it didn't matter. You could walk to the old brick church. But if you were fairly old and took it to go all the way up Lawrence, all the way up Broadway, that's a hike. Even now, I mean, to go on that hike. And so AA led a group of people to separate from the church in order to accommodate these people who needed to be near public transportation in order to go to church. And so, understandably, it was built behind the Mentholatum company. Obviously, AA gave him the property, and it became Grace Presbyterian Church. And AA continued to worship there throughout his life. His children remained with the First Presbyterian Church and went there. But that's where their friends were, and it made sense. He supported the children's home. Remember I told you in his early years he was on the board. It burned, and so he gave the money to rebuild it. Notice he invests in people. Almost always it has something to do with people, particularly young people, was what he favored. This is a bit of an aside, but I think you should know about it. A young African American, he would have not known what the term meant, a young African American minister from Mississippi came to visit him once. And this was what you did if you wanted money. And you'd say to him, "I need some money." And AA would say to you, "Well, first I want to see your books. Before I do anything, I want to see your books. How much do you put into overhead? Secondly, what are you going to do for people? What is it that you can do to help people?" And Dr. Jones, who was this man, said, "I'm starting a school for the children of the Delta, black children of the Delta in Mississippi, so that they can become literate, so they can read and write and get out. And in order to do that, I need money. And I, Lawrence Jones, I, the head of the school, I raise money. It's not I'm just coming to you. You can help us out, but we're helping ourselves out." And the way they did it was in the summers and on vacations, they formed a group of young people, you can see them here, who would go around the country singing gospel music and Negro spirituals. The problem they faced in that and raised money, and the money would go back to the school. The problem with that was, where would they stay? Where would they eat? Because they could not go into the acceptable restaurants and hotels. So Hyde and a man named Musser designed this car. They didn't live in it, but it had a kitchen and it had other facilities so that they could camp out wherever they went. And cook their own meals, buy their own food, and never be dependent upon the facilities of the town that they did. And I've always thought that was wonderful, and he was very much connected with which I'll mention in a minute, the African American community in Wichita, the churches and a variety of things. His great love was fishing, and this is out in Colorado, and he loved the picture. I always have to include it, because he liked the picture. He had built the raft, and he would go out with his fishing line and sit out in the middle of a lake and fish for trout, and he was happy as he could be. In his search for places to which he'd like to contribute, he did not forget his hometown, and especially his employees. To the rear of the Mentholatum Company building on Cleveland, he built a clubhouse. And there he said to his employees, look, you people should be eating a good hot meal every day. I'm going to put on the second floor a set of tables. There's a kitchen. I'll hire a cook. You people handle all the rest of the business. You buy the food, you plan the meals. That's your business. But you should each have a good meal once a day. And on the ground floor was recreational facilities, ping pong tables, things during lunch hour you could go and enjoy what you want. So he did these things, and I learned a lot about this because when the company moves east, which I'm not going to get into, it was during the Depression, many of the employees went with the company. And I would go down after school and help in the mail room. They taught me. And I heard stories, many of I'm repeating, from these women who had grown up in Wichita with them. My favorite was this. He offered every employee of the company who had 2 weeks, they had 2 weeks vacation. If they did not get their salary during the 2 weeks, he would give them a free 2 weeks in what is now called the YMCA of the Rockies in Estes Park, Colorado, which he had helped to found before. And so he said, I will pay all your expenses. I will pay transportation, I'll feed you, I'll let you fish, I'll do all these things if you prefer. If not, take your vacation, you get paid, you do that. And the employees loved it. Mary Plumley, who was a Wichita resident, one of the Wichita residents went east, she said to me, Johnny Mike, that's what I was called, Johnny Mike, that was the first time I ever had left the state of Kansas to go to Colorado. She said it was an experience that none of us had ever had before. And that's a picture of them at the cottage that he had built for himself. AA got fascinated with automobiles, and he kept buying them. If something new came out, he'd buy it. But he never learned to drive. He hired a young African-American in town named Bill Mitchell. And Bill taught his sons how to drive, and they raised hell in town, I gather, with their father's car. But Bill liked cars, and he knew about them so he could fix them. And he always was hanging around, but the main thing was he liked to fish. And so he and AA would decide what day they'd go fishing. And they'd get in the car and they'd go west of town someplace, good fishing hole. They'd take a blanket and they'd spread it out. And they'd bring a picnic lunch. And Bill told me this in 1983, which was the last time I saw him. He said, no, Mr. Hyde would take us, he and I would go out there and we'd fish, and then Mr. Hyde would say, it's time for lunch. So they'd go open whatever had been made for them to eat. And he said, then Mr. Hyde would say, now I'm going to take a nap. So I took a nap. Then we'd get up when the light was going down and we'd fish a little more. We'd put it in our thing and we'd come home. And he stayed with the Hyde family and fished almost all his life. He was a wonderful man to know. He taught me a lot of things growing up. He was AA, and I'm coming to the end, was getting more elderly. He spent a lot of time away from the office. He liked to travel to promote and give talks about the stewardship of wealth. And in the 1920s, after the First World War, he decided to sell his shares in the Hyde Benevolent Society. He said to his sons, I'll sell any of you the shares if you want them, but you gotta pay me cash. No loans, nothing else. You gotta pay me cash. Because, according to my belief that a man should not die with inherited wealth, I want to get rid of the Benevolent Society. And so the boys bought them. My father bought a lot because he was raising a family. Being the youngest, he was starting to raise a family. And Hyde spent the next years of his life making sure, and he was successful, that he would not die with wealth, with accumulated wealth. He had achieved his goal. Ida now was almost totally deaf. I would be brought in, we children would be brought in to see our grandmother, but she was a kind of non-person, but she loved children. And you would be put in her lap, and she would sit there and hug you and take care of you. But we couldn't talk to her because she couldn't hear at all. And the Hydes were big on remedies for deafness. In 1925, Ida and AA celebrated their wedding anniversary, and the family all came and posed in the same order that they did in the 1895 picture. And I won't go through it now, but you can see the same. And the person who substituted for Aunt Jane was Loretta, the one Laura Street's named for, Aunt Reddy Todd, the one that had the pearl-handed pistol. She sort of scared me, I must say, growing up. Then my grandmother, Ida, said, I have saved my wedding dress. And she could still fit into it, and posed for this picture in 1925 with a bouquet of roses, each rose representing one of her 25 grandchildren. That number, by the way, grew to 32. And they saw and knew all but one, which is my youngest brother. The city of Wichita did something, recognizing that AA was coming to the end of his life. They arranged, Mr. Chandler of the First National Bank, arranged a civic banquet at the Forum, and somebody here brought a book from it. There are a lot of them around, but AA didn't want to have it done. And he said, okay, I'll agree if it celebrates the institutions and places that I helped. I want to be it a tribute to stewardship of life. And so they wrote all these different organizations that he had helped. Said, would you write and send a picture? And they put together a book with copies everybody got at the banquet. Down at the Forum, they had this wonderful civic banquet. And the Eagle carried this cartoon of the banquet and some of the institutions which he had sponsored and helped as it went along. You can say Fairmount and Friends and Boys Children's Home, the Mexican Mission. He was very interested in the Mexican church in town. But the Board of Education, sensing his impending death, in a few years, I don't mean that he was dying, decided, having been a member of the first Board of Education, one of the new schools that was built in 1930 should be named after him. And that's the A.A. Hyde Elementary School. And we, my brothers and I, helped fund 10 or 12 years ago, the addition of the auditorium and exercise room that they had created there. And north of town, on some land that he owned, was the YMCA established Camp Hyde. And I believe that's still well, both Hyde School and Camp Hyde, I think, are still very thing. And his home. This is what it looked like, and I remember when we lived in it. There's a nice story, kind of sad. When he knew, again, he was trying to get his wealth, he owned this land, and he owned the house. So I went to City Council of Wichita, and he said to them, look, I've got many more years to live. Wouldn't you like to have a park up on the hill where my house is? It's almost more than a third of the block. I'll give it to you. I'll give it to the city when I die. And he said, that ain't going to take very long. That's coming. But I ask only one request. That is that you allow my wife and I to live there tax-free for the rest of our lives. And the city council voted him down. And so the reason I tell that story is I lived in it. And Mother didn't want us to see it, but my father thought we should see it when we left town to move east. So he took us in the car on the morning that they were beginning to destroy it. And as children, we watched, they had a big crane with a wrecking ball come whamming into the sides of the building as it was torn down. And of course, my father wanted to see it too, because he had grown there. It was a lovely old house. But in the end, my dad said to us, his father said to him, Geordie, nobody wants an old house like this. It was only 50 years old when it was torn down, which tells you something about the character. So he spent the remaining years of his life, Ida died in 1932, going to Colorado, spending the summers in Colorado, enjoying his grandchildren, and living a kind of passive life, having given his money away and enjoying the things which he really liked to do. He dies, and he left specifics on what should be done. He was to be buried at sunset in good Kansas soil in Maple Grove Cemetery, which he had started. And I think, going back to Saul Cohn and Mr. Levy, the synagogue in town, the temple in town, did a memorial service for him when he passed on. So his reach continued to the end. So the small settlement which he had come to in the summer of 1872, and in which he had grown up, much as the city had now become a major metropolis, the largest city in the state of Kansas. Wichita would continue to grow and change. But A.A. Hyde and his generation had passed on. It was the turn of the generation that followed. It was our turn to grow up with Wichita. Thank you very much. Now, what I do on these occasions, my plane doesn't leave till 6, so I'm okay, is to say, if anybody wants to leave now, for heaven's sakes, it won't bother me or at any point. But I'd be glad to stay around for questions. As I've told you at the beginning, I love doing this. I'm a ham at heart. And so be glad to try and answer questions as long as you, well, at least till I have to go out the airport to get my plane. So, yes, sir.
Could you explain how he got his nickname? I didn't hear it if you did.
Bert?
Bert.
Yeah, so, good question. His full name was Albert Alexander. And so that's why the family called him Bert. Yeah. And it was a kind of a nickname, but I never saw it mentioned in the Eagle. which says something about him, that he must have had a somewhat dignified presence, that you wouldn't call him, you know, Bertie or you know, Hyde or something like we were. So that's where it came from. Hey, Albert Alexander. Yes?
What is the park where they tore down the house?
It never came into existence. But one of the places where his name, I'm glad you asked me because I left it out. His name remains on the map of Wichita in 3 places: Hyde School, Camp Hyde, and Hyde Park, down in the Hyde addition. And he deliberately said, when he built the addition or platted, he said, no, in this kind of country, in this, with no trees and no, you know, this barren prairie, there should always be parks so that the people in these little houses would have a place for recreation and could go. And it's kept that, and they called it, I think they still call it, Hyde Park. And there's a church down there, yeah.
What happened to the Mentholatum company?
I don't know whether the name Jewett is still around the city, but that was the people he knew. And his sister had taught school there. And so that ultimately, by 1920, became the center of the manufacturing of mentholatum. And once he began to get out of the company, the brothers, the 6 brothers, 5 by that, at a later stage, agreed that they would keep the company, part of the company here, until AA died, until their father died. And at that point, up to that point, my father would stay here with his father to help manage the plant, and it had certain things. Then, when he died, they would sell the plant, and they would move everything to Wilmington, Delaware, and start anew. And they did. And so we go to Delaware. But, and I don't know, John Reef's not here today, but he knows the story too. But as a consequence of that, the manufacturing of the product became less labor intensive. For example, one of the things the company in Buffalo did was to hire blind people, because they could package very efficiently through digital feeling. They were very good, and they kept them all on. But as they retired, the company mechanized the whole thing so that the Buffalo plant became increasingly efficient. My father dies in 1944, and quite young. He developed a bad heart. And as a consequence, they decided to close the plant in Wilmington and centralize everything in Buffalo. And so it's now outside of Buffalo. It's out of the hands of the family. But it's still made and sold and sells extremely well in Africa and Asia. But out here, it still sells pretty well. They started some new remedies. There's deep heating rub. But they had to take some of the products off the list. Some of them I loved. There was Skeetolatum. That was an anti-mosquito remedy that you could rub on them. There was a shaving thing that was popular. So they're pretty good businessmen. But as my cousin, I was on the board. I have to admit, this puts me politically as a bit of a spot, but I was known as the House Liberal on the board. And so my cousins would tease me about this, would talk about it. But they had agreed, I only knew this later, that when they retired, and they were beginning to reach that age, they would sell the company. It was, you couldn't run a closely held corporation very easily in that sort, because advertising no longer worked through druggists, it worked through Walgreens and Rexall. And what you were buying, and was dull, was space on the racks of the stores like Walgreens. How much would you see the end product, or would you see the full product here, and the cost of that? So that's what happened.